Hi everyone, I am Sokoda, and today I have a very special video to share. For almost 2 years now I've been working on a long time mock project I started on the TTV message boards. I called it Sokodas Weekly Builds. For this project I built a small digital Lego mock every week for 100 weeks. And today I want to talk about these builds. This project was very much inspired by a couple of mini Ninjago builds I did for a contest on Discord server and the mini Rahi I built for my Bionicle set concepts. I've always been a fan of small Lego builds and especially small sets. While I think big models are often very impressive because of all the little details included and their impressive size in general, I always saw smaller builds like a little riddle. In a small build, every single piece makes a difference. A lot of the pieces in Lego's catalog you can't even use. Almost every piece affects the final look of the model, and there's often very little room to hide the base construction of the build. For me, small builds are interesting because they make you think about different ways to use the pieces, and that's what really makes them a lot of fun to build. This is why I decided I wanted to build smaller models more regularly, so I challenged myself to experiment with different part usages and building techniques on a weekly basis. On the 2nd of January 2019, I decided to just go for it. I had no idea if I could pull it off or if it even would be allowed to do a weekly updating topic on the TTV message boards. So I did two things. First, I asked on the boards if there would be any problem with doing that. And second, I gave myself 1 day to build a small model to figure out what these builds would be. My logic behind that was that if I could make one in 1 day, I should be able to make one every week. After getting the okay by Kini, my project started on the 6th of January 2019, and I would continue working on it until today. I'd formulated some rules or guidelines for myself to decide what a weekly build is to me. All my weekly builds must be digital Lego models with less than 500 pieces, uploaded every Sunday in my time zone. My first weekly build was in fact the test model I gave myself 1 day to build. I went with an Exo-Force based model because I liked building smaller mechs and I wanted to set the right expectations. I knew a lot of people just knew me for my Bionicle builds, so I wanted to show early on that these builds would be a lot of different things and not just Bionicle. And that is how it all started. That was 100 weeks and 100 builds ago. Join me today on a little trip looking at these builds and talking about some of them that are very special to me. Chapter 1: Ninjago. Some of you probably know that I'm a huge Ninjago fan. Ninjago has a lot of very interesting designs, which inspired quite a lot of my builds. I especially always enjoyed the villain designs. For me, they are what really make the seasons distinct from each other. This is the reason why I built a lot of small villain vehicles and creatures. I had a lot of fun trying to replicate the style of these different groups of villains and downscaling their existing vehicles. One of the main reasons I wanted to do this are the many motorcycle sets in Ninjago. Many Lego motorcycles are quite large compared to the size of a minifigure, so I wanted to try if I could downscale a lot of the Ninjago motorcycles and other vehicles while keeping the general aesthetic and style of the faction they belong to. There's also one mini vehicle I built that is not based on any villain faction. This one I based on a character from the Ninjago comics, Salil. For this build I tried to think what kind of Ninjago-esque vehicle could work for this character we never got any sets for, and that was an interesting experiment for me. Besides my mini vehicles I also built some smaller scenes inspired by the TV show. In some I tried to replicate specific moments like Kai's true potential or the fight between Gravis and Griffin Turner. Others are inspired by scenes from the show but not direct adaptations, like the mock I call Nia's Training. Two builds I really enjoyed were the Oni Titan and the build I call Wandering the Neverrealm, a microscale Lloyd's Titan mech. For these builds I directly downscale two larger mechs into small brick build figures. By adding some scenery I tried to show the in-universe scale of these mechs while turning the build into little scenes from the show. One very special Ninjago weekly build is the Ninja Nightcrawler Tiny Turbo. This one was indirectly requested on the TTV message boards. I was asked if I could build a model in the style of the Tiny Turbo Lego Racers sets. Because of the small scale and simplicity of these sets, I thought about how I could make the model a bit more interesting. So I decided to build a Tiny Turbo styled version of the Ninja Nightcrawler set and recreate a scene from Ninjago's Sons of Garmadon at that scale. Chapter 2. Bionicle. A lot of the marks I build are system Bionicle creations. I just love to reinvent Bionicle characters in this different building style, and I think it's just a fun thought experiment how Bionicle could look as a system theme. So of course I wanted to build some Bionicle models for this project too. Most of my Bionicle builds were system recreations of construction figures. Some of them of different Titan sets, others Rahi, some of them were even inspired by combination models or fan created Dark Hunters. These were the kinds of builds I really enjoyed in my Bionicle mocks, reinventing and downscaling existing Bionicle models with more modern system pieces and especially the Mixel ball joints. A fun challenge here is to replicate construction pieces with smaller system parts and finding pieces that can replace them at the smaller scale. One of my Bionicle builds I want to highlight here was a brick build version of the Toa Armada in a style I used for a Lewa statue in one of my Bionicle mocks. This one was a request on the TTV message boards and turned out to be one of the most challenging builds. The build worked for Lewa and the simpler shape of the Miru, but for the other mask it just looked weird. I changed the printing around a lot, but to this day it's one of the weekly builds I'm not super happy with. Two other interesting builds were my revamps of the Usanui and the Exo-Toa. The original sets for both can be piloted by a Toa, so I decided to build these marks in minifigure scale and use the minifigures for my LEGO Ideas project. What made things more interesting here were the different proportions and the limited articulation of the minifigures compared to the construction Toa. This is why I had to change up the way the figures fit inside these vehicles, and change the proportions of the Exo-Toa and Usanui accordingly. Probably one of my favorite weekly builds in this category is my mini Battle of Metro Nui. In a way, I've gone full circle with this one. While most other models here are downscaled construction sets built with system parts, this one is a downscaled system Bionicle set, all built around one construction piece, Toa Lee Khan's How. The Battle of Metro Nui was one of my favorite sets growing up, which is why I wanted to include as many little details as possible. But the mask piece kind of dictated the scale here, so I was restricted to a pretty small size for the overall model, and because of that I could only use very select pieces. I still managed to build the Fortress modular though, that way it can be rearranged like the original set. Chapter 3. Star Wars. LEGO Star Wars is one of the longest ongoing and most successful LEGO themes. As a big Star Wars fan myself, I of course wanted to do some Star Wars themed builds here too. Funnily enough, only one of my builds featured in this project is from the actual Star Wars movies, my 66th weekly build where I recreated the iconic Order 66 scene from Revenge of the Sith. All my other builds are based on the extended universe, more specifically the games Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic and Star Wars The Old Republic. The Old Republic era is one of my favorite parts of the Star Wars lore, and I loved the games and always thought they had a lot of cool designs. Sadly, we never got a lot of these designs in LEGO form, because LEGO mostly focuses on the movies and TV shows for their sets, so I decided to build some of them myself. Most of these builds are smaller vehicles, like speeders or creatures from the games. And I also built a lot of different droids. I always enjoy building little robots, and it's fun to try to imitate an existing design at a smaller scale. Two of these droids I even built with real pieces to add to my little Star Wars The Old Republic LEGO collection. One special build in this category is my Typhon the Wellspring mark. The build is a miniature landscape of the planet Typhon, the home of the ancient Jedi in Star Wars The Old Republic. The mark doesn't portray any specific place, I just wanted to build a mark that represents the atmosphere and the feel of the planet. I built this mark in a week where I just couldn't build one of my normally very fun or action-packed models, and I needed to build something more quiet or calm. Chapter 4. Exo-Force. My first Exo-Force model surely wouldn't be my last one. Over the course of my weekly builds I started building downscaled versions of different Exo-Force sets. I heavily relied on the Mixel ball joints to build these small posable mechs here. One of the major challenges for this build was the incorporation of the minifigures. I wanted all my mini-mechs to still be able to hold a minifigure, but especially minifigures with crazy hair pieces like the Exo-Force pilots need quite a bit of space, which often led to the use of the same windshield piece the original mechs had. Overall, this resulted in the main body of the mechs to be a bit oversized in comparison to the limbs. That's why a lot of people called this line of mechs chibi styled, which I really liked as an idea. I think it gives these builds a bit of their own identity. Chapter 5. LEGO Universe. LEGO Universe is what started my obsession with digital LEGO building. So naturally, I wanted to build some models inspired by this fantastic LEGO game. In LEGO Universe, the player travels between worlds in their own custom-built rocket. Every rocket can be split into a front, middle and back part. For my LEGO Universe models, I want to revamp some of these older rockets by using more modern pieces and more complex building techniques, while keeping the 3-segment design. I chose to go for the 4 faction rockets because it allowed me to also implement the styles of the 4 different factions from the game. Additionally, I built a Rex Danger Vest styled rocket. This was my experiment to see what LEGO Universe rockets based on themes and designs that happened after the game's end could look like. For this build, I took a lot of inspiration from the Rex Celsior and other LEGO Movie 2 sets, while still trying to keep the base structure of a LEGO Universe rocket. Besides rockets, I built one more LEGO Universe model, the Dark Spiderling. This model was a request on the TTV message boards, and I released it for the 10th anniversary of LEGO Universe. Back when the game was out, LEGO released a digital model for this creature, but looking back at it, it's not very accurate. So I tried to build one that's closer to the in-game model. The body of the spider in-game is made from some sort of purple and black mass, and has a very round and curved shape, which is quite hard to replicate with bricks. I try to achieve the more rounded shapes by using CCBS pieces in the back of the model. Chapter 6. Other original LEGO themes. As a long-time LEGO fan, there are many different original LEGO themes to get inspired by. Many of my builds were little vehicles or scenery marks inspired by the style and color scheme of these older LEGO themes, but using more modern pieces. For some of them I tried to mix multiple ideas together, like mixing a Mars mission style with the newer Nexo Knights mech building system, or building an alien conquest model with a bit of a post-apocalyptic spin to it. Some of my builds in this category are also direct revamps or reimaginings of older sets, where I try to add some additional detail or functionality. Sometimes I also just try to downsize them. One of them is even just an upscaled version of a Power Minus rock monster. Overall, I wanted to experiment with the style of these older LEGO themes and see what else I could build for them. 2 builds in this category that I think turned out really cool are the Zalex Duster and the Wazo. Both of these builds were requested on the TTV message boards and are based on rather unique LEGO sets. One of them is originally a Duplo set. The other one is the Special Racer sub-theme that was using a lot of very specialized pieces at the time. Because not a lot of the pieces used in these original sets were even in my building program, I did my own creative spin on these models. For the Zalex Duster, I built an upscaled version of the original, trying to replicate the pieces by building them out of smaller parts. For the Wazo, I built a figure inspired by the original model. Somehow, the Duplo set reminded me of a tropical spirit, so I tried to go with that for my reimagining. The latest original theme at the time was LEGO Hidden Side. In total I built 3 Hidden Side models, with the first 2 really emphasizing on the Hidden Side transformation. I tried to build some very LEGO City-like models that had some kind of transformation function to reveal the ghost or monsters. The third Hidden Side build was inspired by a discussion we had on the TTV Patreon chat. We discussed the character from the Hidden Side story that sadly never had any set representation, the Maw. After reading his cool backstory and looking at his very unusual design, I really wanted to build this monster, so I decided to try in one of my weekly builds. Chapter 7. Other franchises. In this category, I put all my builds trying to replicate designs from different movies, games or TV shows that I built for my weekly builds. A lot of these were requests on the TTV message boards. Some of them even from franchises I wasn't too familiar with before, but I got some insight while researching for the builds. Many of these were quite challenging because I had to replicate the design in LEGO form and all that at a pretty small scale. For example, the MSN-04 Sasobi, which is based on a highly detailed Gundam. Here I really had to reduce the design to its very basic characteristics, so I could build it at the small scale while keeping it recognizable. Some of the builds in this category that weren't requests were my 2 Overwatch models. These were inspired by the Overwatch LEGO sets, but based on things from the game that hadn't been done by LEGO yet. I also built a mini model of the Interceptor from Green Lantern the animated series. I already built this spaceship years ago, but I wanted to try if I could build a miniature version. One build that really sticks out in this category is the Sokoda mock. This one was requested on the TTV message boards as well, but it was a bit of a joke, because of the similarity between my name and the name of the car brand Sokoda. But actually, this one was quite challenging for me. I normally build a lot of sci-fi or fantasy models, and not really a lot of realistic cars, so this was quite something different for me. To build this model, I took a lot of inspiration from the LEGO Speed Champion sets. The building techniques used in those sets to create realistic cars that are immediately recognizable are really impressive to me, and I tried to implement some of them in this build. Chapter 8: Original Builds. Over the course of this project, I built quite a few completely original builds too. With these models, I wanted to tell my own little story in a sci-fi universe. I tried to tell a small story across all the builds in this category, by having each build be the next scene in the small storyline. A lot of times I tried to add little secrets and details to the builds to hint at the ongoing story. I also tried to connect the builds via the landscape to show what location the different scenes take place in. The story has two main factions, which I tried to give very different designs. I tried to do this by giving each a very consistent color scheme, and using more round shapes for one of the factions and more angular designs for the other. In general, I can say without a doubt that these builds were the ones that I put the most time and effort into. All the minifigure prints here are completely custom, which often took me a lot longer than the build of the model itself. Especially my builds Message Received and Enemy in Sight, which feature minifigures for important characters for the story, were probably the weekly builds I spent the most time on. One of my main goals with these builds was to get people who look at them to wonder what this world is all about, and maybe think of their own version of the little story that I'm trying to tell. Chapter 9: Special Builds. This category is for the couple of remaining models that don't really fit any of the other categories, or I just wanted to highlight specifically. The first build here is the one I call the Bull. This model was inspired by the American LEGO Masters TV show, specifically their Cut in Half challenge. In this challenge, they cut real-life objects in half and built something creative with LEGO bricks on the other side. I really loved this challenge, so I wanted to do my own little version of it. I decided to take an official LEGO set, the 31079 Sunshine Surfer Van, build it in Stud.io and cut it in half. After that, I wanted to build something very different on the other side. I decided to build a mechanical bull that bursts out of the van. I wanted the two sides to be very different, which is why I went for a more everyday life set and a more fantastical build for the other side. The next build in this category is my Cass vs Arbo mock. This mock is inspired by the webcomic Vindicaris by Serpura, also known as Purple on the TTV channel. After reading the comic, I wanted to try to replicate the mostly black and white art style with only very few colors on the characters in a LEGO mock. So I chose one of the cool battle scenes and tried to replicate it by building the scenery completely in black and white. I tried to use plates as thicker outlines and edges between the pieces as hatch lines to replicate the art style of the comic. For this build, I also made a custom background fitting the art style of the comic and two custom minifigures. It was quite a fun challenge to adapt these characters in this comic style in a minifigure design, without using any new pieces. The next build is in the special builds category because this model just fits too many of the other categories. My 2019 mock. I built this mock as a celebration for my weekly builds going on for an entire year. For me, that was a very big milestone, because I initially only planned to do it for 2019. As we all know, this wasn't the end of my weekly builds, but I wanted to build something to celebrate 1 year of builds every week. So I decided to build miniature versions of previous builds. I tried to add something different for a lot of themes, like the Keeler rack for Bionicle, a mini Grand Titan for Exo-Force, an even smaller Stone Warrior bike for Ninjago, the Imperial Defense Droid downscale for Star Wars, and a mini version of my On Patrol original build. I chose these builds because they were some of my favorites in 2019, and I think they were a good representation of Sokoda's weekly builds in general. And well, speaking of celebratory builds, we almost reached the end of this video. There's only one final build left to look at. My celebration for 100 weekly builds. This is Sokoda's weekly build number 100. I initially had a really hard time deciding what I wanted to do for my 100th model. I knew I couldn't just build a Star Wars, Ninjago or Bionicle model, because I wanted it to represent the project as a whole. I also wanted it to still be a weekly build, so I couldn't just build a giant model or one with more than 500 pieces. After experimenting with different ideas for quite a while, I decided that I wanted to build a model that represents Lego building for me. The mark portrays a brick bursting open and showing all the possibilities to create worlds with Lego as a medium. I wanted to represent the early days of Lego, where it all came from with the classic brick, but also by incorporating the main old themes like castle, pirate, space and town or city. I also wanted the build to be very colorful, which is why I wanted to use a lot of primary colors, like in the old Lego sets. This build for me is a little representation for this whole project, which is why I really wanted to get all the pieces to build it with real bricks. I'll have this little model here on my desk as a reminder of this project, the many good times building and sharing my models, talking to so many cool people in the community, and overall just enjoying Lego as a hobby. I'm Sokoda, and these were my 100 weekly builds. If you want to check out any of them in more detail, they're all on the TTV message boards with their .io or LDD file, so you can check out how they're built or maybe try to build them yourself. And while you're there, why not share a mark yourself? It can lead to quite some adventures in my experience. Thank you all so much for watching and listening to me talk about this project. It's been quite a journey for me, and this video was a nice opportunity to just go back and look at all my old builds. Thanks to everyone that supported the project, who looked at my builds, made requests, gave me feedback. It really means a lot to me, and just thank you all so much, and see you around for more builds yet to come.